Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Walter Scheirer. He is Dennis O. Doughty, Collegiate Professor of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Notre Dame. And today we're talking about his book, A History of Fake Things on the Internet. So, Dr. Scheirer, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So, tell us first, particularly as a professor of computer science and engineering, what motivated you to write such a book, and what is basically its main premise?
Yeah, so this is a great question because it's kind of an unusual thing for a computer science professor who's typically writing code and writing, scientific papers to jump in and write a book that's kind of targeted at a public-facing audience and a book that's really like a history of technology.
Yeah.
For many years in my sort of more traditional research, I had been looking at an area called media forensics within computer science and electrical
Mhm.
engineering. This is kind of a research area that is trying to understand how one can detect manipulated digital images and videos, how one can detect synthesized content, right, that's coming from generative AI now, and other types of synthetic content. And what's interesting about this is like it has a big social component, right? Because like who's creating that content, right? Should we be worried
Yeah.
about it? There's a political component to it. And also, I kind of felt there was an unappreciated history for this. And a lot of people on the technical side of things weren't thinking very deeply about the nature of this content. It's like, where did the tools come from? Why did people create these tools? What does the content look like on the internet? Because a lot of what the field had been doing was looking at kind of canned data created for experiments in the laboratory, not
Yeah.
real examples. And there were a lot of stories circulating, which I suspected were actually fake in and of themselves, right, between researchers about things that
Yeah.
had supposedly happened. So I felt, especially given the political climate, so this, of course, is going back to like 2018, 2019, when I started to think
Mhm.
about this project, right? And all of the sort of political polarization on the internet, and this now sort of pervasive paranoia about fake things. I thought, it's worth jumping in and writing, a history of this. Because again, I felt there was a more interesting story than just that political story. And if you looked at, the popular reporting on this and that period up to the present, right? Again, it's all of this sort of like political alarmism,
Mhm.
but I feel like the internet's a much larger place and there's more going on there. And so that kind of set me out on my journey to dig into this.
Great. So, and a very interesting thing that you also talk about in the book, sort of briefly, is you not only talk about the history of fakeries on the internet, but you also take a step back and talk about the more general history of fakery. So, would you like to tell us a little bit about that, and why do you think it's also important to mention that for then people to understand sort of the history of fake things on the internet itself?
Yeah. So with this particular topic, you can't just arbitrarily say, like, I will start researching it at
Mhm.
the point at which the internet becomes a thing.
Yeah.
There's a much richer history of storytelling in humanity. And so in the book, I go all the way back to antiquity, in fact, to talk about the role of fiction. Like, why do people create stories? Why do we tell each other
Mhm.
these stories? How do those stories evolve over time?
Yeah.
What is the role of fiction in society? Like all of those things are really key to humanity, and that's a really important piece of the internet story. But you have to go way back
Mhm.
to try to understand that. And so again, the book looks at early instances of fake news. Herodotus, right, in his histories, recounts these fantastic stories, things that can't possibly be true. For instance, he reports that there are giant ants in Persia that mine gold. It's like, okay, but like, it's like an obviously fake story, but there's an interesting reason why people in antiquity were telling these stories, why they were filtering a lot of life through Homer, right? The Homeric poems, right?
Mhm.
There are all these interesting ways to think about one's immediate circumstances when you move beyond the immediate circumstances. This is why we developed the novel. This is why, right? Like short stories become an important form of storytelling. This is why we love television shows. This is why we love the movies. And again, like that I think helps explain a lot about the internet, right? But of course, it moves to a participatory mode when we get to the internet era. Um,
So exploring this, and this is also something that you talk about in your book, also connects to questions surrounding how we relate to reality itself, right? So why does exploring such a question matter in this particular context?
Yeah, so a major thing I had to consider in this project was the nature of reality itself.
Mhm,
A lot of people, when discussing fake things on the internet, sort of matter-of-factly say, "Oh, reality, is what really happens,
mhm,
and everything else then is fake." But that's not a great way to explain the situation. Because reality is really what we experience, right? And that, of course, could be things that exist beyond the physical world. For instance, your imagination, right? You experience it, right, as part of your reality, but the projections in your mind are not, what is in front of you in the physical world. Dreams are a part of that, right? All of these
mhm.
interesting things. Fiction, right? When we're reading a novel, right, it's like the imagery is in our mind, right? Our imagination is facilitating that. Even when we watch, television shows, movies, videos online, when we play games online, our brain, right, is interfacing with that material. It becomes part of our reality. And that, of course, right, makes this, I think, a really interesting thing to study because reality is so broad. And again, you can't just sort of dismiss all these things as being outright fakes, not being any part of one's experience because they are, right? All of these things are. So in the book, when I was writing it, I had to be very careful, sort of saying like there is, sort of this virtual space, the internet, and there's a virtual reality there, and there's also,
Mhm.
right, this physical space in the physical world that we exist in, and there's a physical reality there, but they're both different instantiations of reality.
Sure. So getting into the internet itself, do we know how old the history of fake things on the internet is? I mean, are they as old as the internet itself, or are they a little bit more recent than that?
Yeah, in fact, from my research, I mean, as soon as you get these innovations in multi-user networks, multi-user
Mhm,
operating systems, digital spaces where people are interacting, the fake
mhm,
stuff appears right away. And given what I just said, this is hardly surprising because again, we love to tell stories. I think what's interesting about these digital technologies is that they're great communications mediums, right? They better facilitate the transfer of information, and some of that information, of course, is fictional. And a lot of enthusiasts, like in this period, as we're talking about like the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, like they really want the internet. They want to build the internet for that purpose specifically, right? It's like the creative
mhm,
technologies that they're really interested in. It's the social technologies that they're really interested in. It's like making connections to other people. And there's a really rich history there in terms of the thinking, right? The philosophies behind this. A lot of engineers are really excited about the media theories of Marshall McLuhan. So McLuhan is a really important mass communications scholar at the
mhm,
University of Toronto in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And what's interesting, he's kind of remembered as being like a key piece of like that counterculture era of like the 60s and 70s. But he's like, kind of like a straight-laced like professor. But he really I think does a phenomenal job of like anticipating the near future, like what is on the horizon when it comes to information networks. And he's really, really excited about this potential of uniting the globe on these information networks. And he makes this observation that, in the future, you'll be able to project your imagination to other people, right? You'll be tapping your central nervous system and moving that information to other people in real time, and experiencing what they're experiencing, even though you have no physical contact with them. Um, this is an idea I think that really, again, motivates a lot of people who are, participating in that counterculture, but also they have some sort of technical ability to go
mhm,
off and build it, right? We have this like really like dry narrative of how the internet started. What's the history of the internet? Everybody's like, oh, it was, the Department of Defense in the United States creating this infrastructure, this distributed infrastructure to withstand, some sort of Soviet nuclear first strike. And that, of course, happened, but that wasn't, I think, what was motivating the engineers behind the scenes. That's sort of like the modus operandi. It's like, okay, like we need the funding, we need, some sort of like mechanism to move this forward. But deep down, right, we want to do this other thing. And they know, of course, right, once the infrastructure is built, you're going to get ordinary people moving into it. It's not just going to be the defense community, the intelligence community that's operating in this space. But what I think is fascinating when you look at the early instances of fake content, because the internet is so heavily populated by these communities, right, these like government communities, you still see the storytelling because that had been ingrained in military culture, right? You get like people writing stories about UFOs, strange lights in the sky, all of this stuff that was sort of embedded into the aerospace and industry because that was already part of that culture, right? So this is kind of like a universal phenomenon, and that's exactly how McLuhan sort of describes it back in the 60s, which is pretty interesting.
And does the internet introduce new ways of people faking things? I mean, ways that didn't exist before?
Yeah, so absolutely. Especially as you get into like the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, you start to see new creative technologies become available to the ordinary person.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's fascinating. The book, I look at the early history of Photoshop. So that is, again, like a piece of software we're all familiar with, right? It has stood the test of time. It was created in the 1980s, which is just crazy to think about today, right? Because if you think this is like a very modern piece of
Yeah.
software with all these great features. Of course, Adobe has been adding to that feature set over the decades. But it was pretty sophisticated right off the bat. And it was created by two brothers who were really interested in photography. They had this vision again of digital spaces where ordinary people were going to be able to play around with photography in a way that only darkroom technicians, professional photographers had been able to do up until that point. So this is again another sort of forward-looking
Mhm.
technology. Um, when you have the dot-com boom of the 90s, a lot of people who had no experience with computers kind of get drawn into these new social technologies. They're signing on to the internet for the first time. A lot of technologies that we sort of take for granted now, like email, were kind of novel back
Mhm.
then, and they become again this mechanism for storytelling before there's social media. And then finally, when you get to the early 2000s, right, you have something that sort of looks like, McLuhan's Global Village, and that the whole world is connected on these platforms and everybody is telling stories, right? You see this like massive influx again of media that is created from the bottom up, right? It's coming from these amateur communities, but it's making use of these new tools, right? That are
Mhm.
being put out so people again can sort of project their imaginations into the space. And that, continues to the present day when we have these generative AI systems, right? Which are kind of like
Mhm.
the next generation of the same idea.
And do we have any idea at all how much of the internet is fake?
That's a really good question. I don't think anybody has a perfect handle on that. I know some folks have attempted to figure this out. For instance, I know New York Magazine a few years ago put out a piece where they tried to quantify this, and I feel like even their quantification of this is kind of loosey-goosey.
Mhm.
They did make some good insights though. They noted that it is highly likely that the majority of traffic on social media platforms is bot driven. And again, I think if you're just sort of like a user of social media, you sort of know
Mhm.
this. Number one, there's a lot of concern about like algorithmic feeds and algorithmic content, but there are even dumb bots that have been around now for decades. So these are like, automated pieces of code that, have an ability to generate content, mainly an ability to comment, right? This is like an early problem when social media appeared.
Mhm.
Even before social media, when you had, like forums and like comment sections on news sites, you'd get these kind of like spammy troll posts, right? Some of it was just advertising. In fact, a great deal of it was advertising. Some of it, though, like was appearing in a political context, right? You'd have bots that were, designed to send messages of a certain political orientation and automatically respond to certain keywords that were identified on these feeds. And that just generates a lot of noise on social media. This is like something I think like everybody sort of agrees is bad. It's not good. Even if you agree with the message of the bot, you sort of know that it's just a spammy automated message. Um, and that, I think is like more or less like uninteresting, right? When we think about fake messages. But I think again, there's entire other genres of fake content on there that are just massive, right? Like think like fandoms on the internet. Again, this is like a mode of storytelling. It's fictional. But you have these massive communities, of fans of different media franchises, like think like Star Wars, different anime series, all these different things,
Mhm.
right? Where people are just writing their own stories and sending them around. Meme culture is just so important to the internet these days, right? And it keeps evolving, which I think is fascinating. If you look at meme culture now, it's very much like video driven on Instagram and TikTok. And people again are like riffing on these ideas, remixing content. A lot of that is fake, right? A lot of that again is like taking a specific fictional trope and reworking it over time. And again, that's the content that people love. That's the content that people are experiencing it. You can think about too, like augmented reality, virtual reality, right? These are things again, they're not like the physical world, right? They're sort of these artificial creations, but they're very popular. And you could throw in like gaming communities into that too, right? And this blows up
Mhm.
just so massively. And again, I'd say like most of these things like are pretty positive, not the bots, but like a lot of these other things that are participatory, people really enjoy. I think once you move out of the realm of partisan politics, a lot of the fake stuff is quite interesting. Because again, it's like creative fiction versus like destructive political content.
So earlier you've talked a little bit about photo editing, and I would like to ask you, and perhaps we can expand this also to other kinds of fakeries or ways that people fake things on the internet. Do we know what goals people have when they alter a photo, when they edit a photo, and they put a fakery up on the internet?
Yeah, okay, so this is a really interesting question, and one I looked at in depth in the book. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, this whole project started with my experience with media forensics, right? And so there was
Mhm.
an assumption in that community that like people who do this are doing something bad, right? They're
Yeah.
trying to revise history and they're trying to create some kind of like perfect fake, right? That'll allow them to revise the historical record. It turns out historically that doesn't really work, right? We
Mm.
don't really have many instances where like a perfect fake has really resonated. In many cases, again, even when that sort of happened, it was debunked very quickly. And part of the reason there, which I think is fascinating, like there's a long history of this kind of photographic manipulation. Again, we sort of tie it to like authoritarian and totalitarian governments in the 20th century, in the era of film photography.
Mhm.
And there was this like pervasive idea in the like sort of national security community here in the United States that like this was happening in these other places, right? So we're thinking like the Soviet Union, Maoist China, the Third Reich, fascist Italy, right? They produced a lot of edited photographic content. And of course, in many cases, right, when they were doing that, there was a malicious intent. But what's sort of interesting when you go back to those old photographs, they're not really perfect fakes. In fact, some of them are pretty bad. And that's kind of puzzling because if you look at the history of photographic manipulation in the era of film photography, it was quite possible to produce very realistic fakes. For
Mhm.
instance, right, you could remove somebody from a photograph and you could replace them with somebody else and make it look pretty good. But what I found looking at these old cases, like they were like obviously edited, right? Like huge gaps in photographs of, political leaders, gaps that could have been filled in. Um, One particularly striking example I found from Albania, censors had removed some sort of men in a group photograph, but they left the shoes, right? So it's like that's like terrifying when you're looking at this photograph where it's like these people were removed, right? You know they're missing because the shoes are still there. In many cases, I think a more correct interpretation of this style of editing is that it's meant to send an intentional signal to the observer, like we can
Mm.
erase people if you mess up, we can erase you too, right? What's also fascinating too is like the originals tend to like persist, right? It's like again like the censors remove somebody from a photo, like they have this revised image, but history continues to record the original. It's like we always have these like side by side comparisons, which is kind of interesting. And when you sort of think about that, it's like, okay, maybe it's like those like obvious fakes, right, that are the most dangerous because the message is very clear, right? Those perfect fakes really haven't worked. And so again, I think that whole sort of assumption that again there are bad people out there trying to revise history just has not that's not really the way this works, right? And that's not really how it becomes effective. I think again more explicit messaging tends to resonate better. And it's funny too when you look again at the history of this, like again looking back at say like the Soviet Union, there's like an entire genre of like Soviet era humor about how the government lies to you, right? It's like people did not believe the official media record, right? Because it was always altered. That was not surprising to people who lived in the Soviet Union. But again, here in the West, again, there was this like pervasive fear that like there was totalitarian control over the media, but it didn't quite work like that in practice, which is interesting. And then if you go back further in history, like looking at the history of film photography itself, photos are being edited right away, right? There's this myth, and that's sort of propagated over to the area of media forensics that photographs could be trusted. In the past, right, we could trust them because we didn't have Photoshop, right? It wasn't possible, right? Many people sort of believe to edit photographs. That was not true at all. Basically, as soon as the camera is invented in the 19th century, photographers are faking their photographs. The first fake photograph appears in 1840. It's produced by one of the inventors of an early camera process, and it just kind of spirals from there. But it's mostly used in a sort of like commercial or creative way. For instance, right, when you'd sit for a portrait in a studio in like the 19th century, you could often like order some special effects. Like some of these effects again would just make the photo look better, like what we do now with like photo editing apps on our phones. Low pass filter, right? It's like we can like apply, right, some smoothing on the face like through our app, and our complexion looks better. You could do that using some basic techniques in the dark room, right? That was well known by photographers. You could add objects into scenes, you could remove objects, you could add all sorts of interesting special effects, right? Which I think have sort of been forgotten by a lot of people, even photographers. But again, this was like all very much standard in the era of film photography. So right, like this idea that the photograph was like a trusted object, I feel was a myth. And a myth that persists to this day, which is interesting. From a community again that seems very keen on policing, right, falsehoods.
But because people, particularly nowadays, are very worried about misinformation and on the internet specifically, I have to ask you this question. So you've already sort of alluded to the answer, I guess, in my previous question, but are there many people who actually fall for fakeries on the internet? I mean, whether it's photos, videos, or other kinds of content, or are people usually, or it's usually easy for people to figure out or find out that they're fakes?
Yeah, so this is the question everybody seems to want an answer to. And again, this is like it's difficult because like we just don't know. And I'll explain why this is really difficult. Even if you were gonna like interview people, like why this is really difficult to answer. So I think yes, people of course do fall for these things. I think where you see most people being legitimately duped, cases like that are just scams, like criminal scams. Right, for instance, right, it's like someone is trying to like get money from you, right? So they're creating a bunch of fake media
Mhm.
to perhaps like impersonate your relative. There's a
Yeah.
lot of concern about voice synthesis techniques or targeting the elderly, right? All sorts of like phone scams, somebody impersonating a relative, trying to extract money out of somebody who probably like isn't cognitively all there because they're very old. Like I feel like those scams are becoming more prevalent and they're working, which is very troubling. What I think does not work as much as people think it works, like the political disinformation. Now, again, this may seem surprising because a lot of people are like, well, it's like my crazy uncle like believes, right, all of this stuff, right, which is obviously fake. What I think is going on in the realm of politics is something akin to professional wrestling. Do you know like the fake wrestling, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But yeah, so this is a really interesting effect where like professional wrestling is entertainment, right? The matches are staged, right? There are writers
Mhm.
who create the characters. What I think is really interesting, this is like a fandom where like people strongly identify with the characters. And when fans are talking about these wrestling matches, they're talking about them as if they were real.
Mhm.
But deep down they know it's fake, right? They know it's
Yeah.
entertainment. And you see these circumstances, it's like everybody knows it's fake, and like people, very pedantic people, will like, confront professional wrestling fans and be like, that's fake, right? That's fake wrestling. And eventually the fans will be like, yeah, we know, but that's not the point, right? It's like we identify with the fandom. I think you say the same thing in partisan politics, where people identify so strongly with a political party that they talk about these things as if they were real, right? Like the sort of political mythology. And you see this like regardless of political orientation.
Mhm.
And so even though they know that these they're talking about things that didn't actually happen in the physical world,
Yeah.
they still strongly identify with the stories. And so they're probably not going to concede that they're fake, right?
Mhm.
And that's a complicated thing to unpack, but it's like a well-known phenomenon in the realms of like anthropology, sociology, etc. And in fact, anthropologists say like it's sort of like when people are like lying to you in that manner, it's really interesting, right? Because it's
Mhm.
saying something about the culture they're embedded in. And so you see a lot of that on the internet, right? It's not just politics, it's other things too. Like I say, like any fandom, right? Like you have people talking about these things, right? There's people on the internet, they're like, it's like I'm a Jedi Knight, right? I identify, right, with this fictional like
Yeah.
religion from like George Lucas's mind. It's the same
Yeah.
type of effect, which I think is really fascinating. And so
Uh,
again, if you want to quantify this, I have no idea because again,
mhm.
you have a lot of people that will be telling you stories as you're trying to gauge this. You may be unjustly saying they've been duped in some horrible way, right? When in fact they have not been duped, right? They sort of know what's going on. They're just thinking in a different mode when they're responding to the question.
But when it comes to the politics itself, just to make this point clear, are you saying there that it might be the case that at least in some specific circumstances or situations, people might say that they believe fake things that for example, they preferred party claims or a preferred politician claims?
Yeah, exactly.
Just to signal their group membership, but then deep down they actually do not believe them.
Yeah, that's a good and concise way to describe this, right? So it's in-group signaling,
Mhm.
which is interesting. Now, that's not to say that like nobody is duped. In fact, like I worry about the people that actually are duped, right? Especially if the political rhetoric is violent in some way.
Yeah.
That's a big problem. Like I look at the ethics of that at the end of my book, because again, I feel like this is an issue. And on the internet, people tend to be reluctant to correct, right, these misunderstandings because you get a lot of trolling behavior as well,
Mhm.
which is a huge problem. In fact, I think a lot of the trolling too sort of stems out of this effect, right? Because if you have a group, an out group that sort of believes that you believe these things, you may troll them quite heavily by saying even more ridiculous things and claiming to believe them. Right, that sort of keeps you in the news, right? That keeps the arguments going. It brings more attention to your movement, etc.
And do we know if there are many people on the internet that actually create fake content? Because I mean, I've had on the show people that work specifically on misinformation on the internet, and most of them tell me that when you look at it, it's actually a very small number of people that, for example, put out political misinformation on the internet, but then because I mean, many times it's outrageous, then it garners a lot of attention, but it's actually a tiny number of people doing it, and then many more people consuming it, but the ones who create it are not that many.
Yeah, so I'd argue against this because if you take my more expansive view of the internet and all of
Mhm.
the participatory, right, media generation, The
Okay.
use of tools like Photoshop, the use of generative AI, Midjourney, DALL-E, right? All these systems, all the content flooding, people using, facial filtering apps, right? Like all of this is generating quote unquote fake content, right? So that's
Mhm.
basically all of us, right? We're all doing it. Think about how many people are creating their own memes, right? This is a staggering number of people. The people involved in these fandoms, right? This is like many millions of people. Again, there's a human inclination to tell stories, right? That's something really fundamental about our humanity.
Yeah.
I think again, if you're describing this in this very niche way, right, where it's like, explicit political disinformation, yeah, that probably is a really small number of people. But this phenomenon is much broader, right? And again, I think there's a lot of these things get entangled too. One thing I like to think a lot about, parody and satire on the internet, especially political parody and satire. Some stuff looks like disinformation, but it's actually making a completely different political point, right? If
Mhm.
you stopped at the surface level message of the content, you're completely missing the point. And a lot of meme culture, especially like political meme culture, works that way. But again, this is kind of part of the motivation for this book, right? I just kept seeing a lot of commentators like stopping at the surface level, and you just miss so much of the interesting
Mhm.
stuff when you do that.
So let me ask you now about video specifically, because in more recent times we have deep fakes, we have AI generated video content and all of that. And sometimes, I mean, people get into lots of trouble because particularly when it comes to deep fake porn, they can actually generate videos where they put a particular person, it's usually women, unfortunately, in a porn video, and sometimes it can be very, very damaging to their social reputation. So do you think that's uh, perhaps something that we should worry more about because it's a little bit more sophisticated or not?
Yeah, in fact, I would argue this is like a primary concern when we think about fake content, especially deep fakes. Like the history of deep fakes, is troubling, right? So again, this is something
Mhm.
we hear about a lot, almost always in a political context, though there has been growing reporting on the specific instance which you mentioned, right, which is the creation of deep fake pornography. It turns out the deep fakes algorithm was created specifically for that. When it first hits the internet, right, it's sort of being billed as a way to create your like fantasy porn, right? You can take some actress's face and again, it's always like in a sort of female context, which I think
Mhm.
is incredibly misogynistic. And it's like you can create, some scene using, some existing pornography. And this becomes quite popular. Then along the way, it became a mechanism for re creating revenge porn, right? It's like, oh, you don't actually have to film a real scene. You can take your ex's face, right, and post it into porn. And even more troubling, now it's like middle school students are like bullying other students using this, right? Trying to humiliate them. I think all of this is appalling. I think this is like one specific scenario where deepfakes are highly effective. And this is related to my earlier point about obvious fakes being more effective than perfect fakes. Like even a bad deep fake, right, that is obviously fake can humiliate somebody, right? Like
Mhm.
that's just like devastating, right? If you're like,
Mhm.
an eighth grade girl and all of the boys in your school, right, are circulating these fake porn videos, right, that are obviously fake, right? I think this is terrible, right? This is a
Mhm.
serious social problem. I think it's endemic too of like this broader porn culture, which I find appalling on the internet. But again, a lot of that involves fake content. Um, Coming back to the politics of deepfakes, though, those almost never work, right? I feel like, we talk a lot about them. There hasn't really been an instance that you can sort of definitively say this deepfake swayed an election, right? This deepfake had a serious political implication. They almost always appear posted by anonymous accounts, right, that are not any major news source. They're almost immediately debunked right away because again, they depict public figures, especially politicians who have public, schedules. They are scrutinized by the media minute by minute, right? They're constantly like, like press pools following these people. And so it just doesn't work, right? And again, like I think people now sort of are savvy, right? They're like, wait a minute, this sensational video I'm looking at of this politician, if this were real, I probably would have heard about it from a paper of record, right? From a major, news source. And instead, nobody's talking about this, right? It's just circulating on social media.
And what about shock content websites? I mean, I remember back in the mid 2000s when I was an adolescent that we were all the time looking at that kind of content.
Yeah.
At a certain point, it was almost like a rite of passage, particularly for boys, that we really had to expose ourselves to those kinds of websites. So why are they so popular?
Yeah, I think this is another important piece of the history of fake content on the internet. Very early in the sort of, like .com era, like shocking material was starting to gain an audience. There was one website in particular, rotten.com, which I think is really fascinating. It was definitely like a very popular website. Like looking back, actually, it's kind of shocking that like it was so popular. It got a lot of mainstream attention because it received so much traffic, and it was routinely like posting content that was like irresistible. You couldn't not look, right? Like a big early win for that site was a picture that allegedly depicted the fatal crash that killed Princess Diana, right? So this is like an internet form of rubbernecking on the road, right? It was like an accident. And again, that was such a major news story. Like the whole world is paying attention. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, look, the photo is on the internet. Now what's interesting about that photo is it was completely fake. It didn't depict the accident at all. The French government was chiming in saying, this does not match, any sort of emergency responder vehicle type that we have in France. But people kept looking, right? Which is really, really interesting. And the site, again, just would find odd things. Some of it was real, some of it wasn't. It was really sort of an internet version of, P.T. Barnum's museum, right? This sort of like sideshow type of entertainment, which was very popular in America for many decades. And I think it is more along the lines of um, storytelling, right? Again, like cultural commentary through, right? These stories versus something that was really malicious, right? Like a form of disinformation. Again, I feel like the site like is very much like situated, in this longer tradition of storytelling. Which again is really, really interesting. And it remains popular for many years. It's not until really social media becomes dominant in terms of like where people are going that the site kind of fades away.
Yeah.
It was very much like a piece of like the dot-com boom that sort of like lives on right up until the point where social media takes off. And again, a lot of it was just again like it left people guessing, which I think was like the most intriguing part of the site. It's like this could be real, right? Like there's something here, right? Like maybe, just maybe, no, it's real. And the creator of the site again was really good at creating sort of ambiguous like descriptions of things, like describing things in ambiguous terms that always left people guessing, which I think is really interesting. So again, a lot of people were like horrified by the site. There was a lot of terrible stuff on there. But again, more along the lines of like a sideshow attraction and not really like political, right, or sort of malicious in any way. Which again, like in context, I think makes sense.
And in what ways do computer hackers relate to fake things on the internet? I mean, what's the relationship here?
Yeah, so hackers were behind the scenes for a lot of these things we've been talking about. For instance, Rotten.com was created by somebody who was around the hacker scene, right? A hacker who went by the handle Soylent. He was an early text file writer. And so text files are like these like short little stories. Sometimes they were technical, sometimes they weren't, sometimes they blended storytelling
Mhm.
and technical content. And it was a very low bandwidth era, even up through like the early 2000s, right? A lot of people didn't have broadband of any sort, right? Wi-Fi wasn't really a thing. And so hackers find like really interesting ways to communicate like in these low bandwidth mechanisms. And what's interesting about computer hacking, again, we kind of stereotype it, oh, like these are like lone individuals like in a basement breaking into systems, doing these malicious things. And that's not really the way the subculture worked. Number one, it was a subculture. It
Mhm.
was very social. It was very creative. It was more about the creative use of technology or sort of like using technology in unanticipated ways. The designer created this product, but you sort of hacked it to figure out, oh, like I can enable like these features the creator never really intended by putting these things together, adding things, right, removing things. And there's like this long history of people operating in this mode. And so the computer hackers of like the sort of like 80s, 90s, and 2000s are doing that, but using social technologies.
Mhm.
They're obsessed with early computer networking, like bulletin board systems, because again, it allows them to connect to other people who are thinking similar things. And what's fascinating about this text file culture that develops in parallel to this, um, there's just a tremendous amount of fake stuff, right? Because again, like they're storytelling, right? They're writing little stories. They're trying to build a proper subculture, right? That usually means you need some foundational myths. So hackers, like, are talking about these fantastic like escapades, some of them blending some real, information, right? It's like people were
Mhm.
actively breaking into computer systems, but sometimes talking about things they found there that did not exist, right? UFO material, for instance, right? All these interesting things that would make these text files just so irresistible to newcomers, right? To the subculture. And hackers are really good too at identifying flaws in systems, right? So they're thinking about
Mhm.
this media ecosystem that is evolving quite rapidly, right? Especially when you get into the dot-com era of the 90s, they're thinking about disinformation. It's like if you weren't like sort of virtuous, right? Most hackers were. What ways could you exploit the media, right, to social engineer people in dangerous ways? They're thinking about the media very broadly, which I think is really interesting. A lot of the hackers I talked to were quite media savvy.
Mhm.
A lot of the material they were producing decades ago resonates, I think, today because they really anticipate where all this was going. They
Mhm.
sort of, again, like Marshall McLuhan I mentioned earlier, like have a really strong sense of the trajectory of the technology and how people will use it socially. And again, it's something I think a lot of people don't give hackers credit for. Again, a community that just love the internet still loves the internet, but the writing was on the wall in terms of where a lot of these things were going for them. And again, they were trying to send out warning signs in some cases, but a lot of people were ignoring it or just didn't think it would ever sort of come to fruition.
And talking about the media more generally, how do you look at the relationship or dynamic between traditional media and the internet and new or alternative media in this particular context of fake things?
Yeah, so I'll point out again, like there are a lot of assumptions we make about the traditional media versus the internet today,
Mhm.
these digital mediums that we use for communication.
Yeah.
Um, Fake news was always a problem. In my book, I look at cases of this. Again, journalists have a habit of sensationalizing stories. That is nothing new. There are strategies you can use if you're being interviewed. I'm not doing this here, but when you're being interviewed to like inject, information that the reporter is going to report on, because there is such a good hook there. Um, a lot of traditional media is a business, and of course you need to sell product.
Mhm.
And so again, a lot of sensational reporting becomes problematic. Again, that's nothing new. I think what is new, the participatory nature, right? Because again, there's a lot of gatekeeping in traditional media. Um, you have to like, go through a process to become a professional reporter, right? There's a lot of training, right? You need credentials. If you're gonna like work in prestige media, right? Like you have to be elite, right? You have to like go to the right schools, know the right people, be a really good writer, all these different things.
Mhm.
You can avoid all of that gatekeeping if you just publish your own stuff online, right? You can become a YouTuber, right? And say whatever
Yeah.
you want, right? You can like create TikToks and say whatever you want. So you have this divide now between like a very elite, like, media, right? Like that is sort of like pushing content top down. And then everybody on the internet, right, creating their own media, and it's coming from the bottom up. I think that's a huge change in the media, right? Because that really didn't exist until very recently with these digital technologies, right? With computer networking. Um, that again, that's not to say that one way is better than the other. I
Mhm.
think there are advantages to both, right? A lot of that gatekeeping, if you have really honest journalists, right, that are really scrutinizing their sources, that are trying to avoid sensationalism, right? Like you're going to get really good coverage of a topic. That said, sometimes, right, like the wisdom of the crowd is valuable, right? Sometimes public sentiment is telling you something different than what the reporters are telling you, right? And that could be really important. But there's a lot, again, of storytelling on both sides, which makes it complicated.
And what does AI add to the picture here when it comes to fake things on the
Yeah,
internet?
everybody's
Because,
asking
you
this
know, I
these
have
days.
to ask you this because people are obsessed with AI now because of OpenAI, ChatGPT,
Yeah,
Sora, and
yeah.
all of that. So,
So again, I'm a computer scientist, so I try to take a reasonable view of this. I'm not freaking out about this at all. I
mhm,
don't think this is like an incredible revolution that appeared suddenly. Again, a lot of that is sensational reporting around this, and
yeah,
also the PR operations of these companies that are producing these products, like working in overdrive to promote these
yeah,
sensational takes on the technology. I do think it's really important. I think it's interesting. Though in the book, I look at it in context. There is a long history behind things like generative AI that, again, is largely being ignored. Which part of that I think is there's a lot of complicated technical material, right, that you have to sort of sift through. But the idea of synthesizing content goes back decades. There was a lot of work on it. It was just really hard to do in a practical sense because you didn't have the internet in like the 1960s. Sure, you had really good probabilistic generative models operating in a Bayesian context, et cetera, but that was like all math, on the chalkboard. You didn't have graphical processing units, right? These like supercomputers, right, that are packaged up for our home computers. So it's just really difficult to do, right? So again, you see this inflection point more recently where like got a ton of data on the internet. You also have these GPUs. You can put these things together, and all of a sudden, right, these older ideas become quite useful. And I think the way people are using these things is actually mostly good. Again, coming back to a lot of these like fandoms I've been talking about, there are all
mhm,
sorts of interesting generative models that can like recast content in the style of whatever you love. There are a lot of people creating digital art. There's an entire new sort of opening for artists, like in this digital space. A lot of creativity, a lot of people like doing really interesting installations, right? Using combinations of like, observer interaction with a generative AI system to change, the sort of experience from person to person. All of this is really great. Now, of course, again, there's a lot of hysteria over this as well, right? It was like, oh no, ChatGPT, right? It's going to, end education as we know it because all students will cheat. As an educator, I think that's like a ludicrous proposition because you really have like no faith in yourself as an educator. You have no trust in your students. There are always going to be cheaters, right? I think there's like some baseline of cheating that like doesn't fluctuate very much, and like the cheaters are just going to adopt new tools. And then you have a lot of students that actually want to learn, right? And they're not going to use it that way. I think this is kind of silly. And the other thing too is like these systems again they're not quite human-like either.
mhm.
Um, especially with like image and video synthesis, it's often very easy to see that, oh, this is like an image that's come from one of these systems. In fact, I can almost tell now. I've looked at so many, like Mid-Journey, DALL-E images. I can sort of like fingerprint the system just by looking at the image, where it's like, oh, like that came from Mid-Journey, right? Like, it's like it's not quite, I think, at the point where again, like everything is falling apart. And again, for all the reasons I mentioned too, in terms of like how people sort of vet information. I don't think this is a disaster scenario. I think for the most part, these technologies are pretty interesting and good.
So I have two more questions here. The next one is, I think you've already sort of touched on these slightly earlier, but could you tell us about this idea of myth building? I mean, what is myth building and in what ways does it relate to fake things on the internet?
Yeah, so turning back to the field of anthropology, a lot of what I'm talking about here is really well known, especially like among scholars who study different cultures.
Yeah.
Studies like trying to understand like how we communicate, like how we interact as peoples. The stories are really diagnostic. Claude Levi-Strauss, is an incredibly important thinker from the 20th century. I think he has just an excellent handle on how people communicate in general. And I'm rather shocked that more people don't talk about the internet through the lens of Levi-Strauss. So he argues
Mm.
that people think in two different ways. One is rational thought, and this is really in the present day, like all we tend to think about when we think about thinking, right? You know, it's like people are highly rational creatures, right? We filter
Yeah.
everything through logic. We only use observable evidence to make decisions that will lead to our behaviors in the world. And when you see people faking things, that's irrational and that's bad, right? Like we should only think purely rationally. If you look at the history of the internet, there's actually like a prominent subculture that develops around like this idea of rational thought, where you get these rationalists. Many of them are computer scientists and mathematicians. And they have again this like very specific notion of what thinking should be, and they just
Mm.
despise everything, right? That isn't that. Um, Now, rational thinking is important. Again, I'm a computer scientist. I appreciate, right, what logic allows us to do. All these digital technologies we're talking about are underpinned by, right, formal logic. But at the same time, that misses a lot of how we think, right, on a day-to-day basis. We started talking about, in this podcast, the imagination, dreaming.
Yeah.
All of these things fit into what Levi-Strauss describes as mythical thought. So he argues equally important to rational thought is mythical thought, thinking beyond your immediate circumstances through fiction. This is extremely important for problem solving, he argues, because you're quite limited in terms of your immediate observations.
Yeah.
If I can think of something that doesn't exist now, maybe I can figure out how to build it, like and cobble together all these pieces. Um, and bring into being something fundamentally new. Ironically, engineers, scientists, all these highly rational people do this all of the time, right? If they don't use their imagination, they're kind of stuck, right? With what they have in their immediate surroundings, and that's not good. So Levi-Strauss has a sweeping sort of view of all this, right? All of the sort of creativity, all the myths, all of the religions, right? He wraps all of this up, and he's arguing you can't really exist successfully as a person unless you do both of these things in your mind. And if you view the internet in that context, then it makes a lot more sense, right? It's like, oh, like it's not this purely rational space it was built out to be, right? Those rationalist communities were completely wrong about this. Even earlier, right, there's this notion of the internet as an information superhighway. Right, it'll
Yeah.
be a database of facts, right? This is like the marketing of the internet, in the 90s. Big companies love this idea, it's like we'll go there for commerce and education. It will only be serious, right? And this is going to like, propel humanity forward. But that's not really why people were going to the internet, right? They realized, wait a minute, all these interesting creative pieces of software exist there. All these virtual communities are being bootstrapped. We love the social aspects of it, right? That's much better than this information superhighway thing, which is pretty bland and corporate. And that really fulfills, right, what McLuhan is talking about when he envisions this, which is very much in the mode, again, of Levi-Strauss, right? These were all very popular ideas in the mid-20th century.
Yeah.
And so that, I think, is a much better way to think about the internet, which I think, if you're thinking about that, like, may chill you out if you're so paranoid about people faking things.
And do you think that this has also something to do with the way that we create relationships with other people, how we relate socially? Because I mean, in terms of how we build a social identity, the kinds of shared social identities that we have, I mean, they are very much based on myth building as well,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, foundational myths, right? I mean, those are
Mhm.
key to any sort of culture, any sort of
Mhm.
community. And again, they're really useful, right? And I think what's fascinating going back to like antiquity, right? It's like almost everything that is serious is like filtered through the Homeric poems, right? Like, why are
Mhm.
people doing that? It's because they can evoke, right, the characters from those poems to express like certain sentiments, right, certain political ideas, and it would put everybody on a common basis, right? Everybody was
Mhm.
speaking that language.
Yeah.
That hasn't changed, right? Again, you see lots of different communities doing this. We do this in politics today, right? We do this like, in all these different subcultures we've been talking about. And all of that is actually good, right? That's important. That's always been a piece of human communication.
So my last question then, how much of a problem do you think fake things on the internet are, actually?
Yeah, I don't, as I've been saying, I don't think it's the existential problem people are describing it as. I
Mhm.
think that is pretty silly. That is an overgeneralization, and in
Yeah.
some sense, something that is fake. That said, we did talk about some legitimate social problems we should be very concerned
Mhm.
about. Like, I don't think it's great that middle schoolers are creating fake porn, right? That's really bad. We
Yeah.
should do something about that. I don't think, right, like trolling, right, that's like bullying people online, right, like, and humiliating them using, right, targeted fake content is good.
Mhm.
I don't think it's good that elderly people are being targeted by scams using synthetic voice tracks of their relatives. These are the real problems I think we should be focused on. And again, like thinking about how we want to use this technology well. I
Mhm.
think if we backed off the hysteria related to partisan politics, right, we could more effectively respond to these problems and probably be happier, healthier, and enjoy the internet a bit more.
Great. So the book is again a history of fake things on the internet. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Scheirer, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm easy to find. I'm a professor at the University of Notre Dame. If you just Google my name or use any of the many now generative AI search tools, you can find my website. But if you want a shortcut, it's just wjshire.com. I'm also on X/Twitter. It's just my name is my handle. You can easily find me there. Feel free again to shoot me a message if you're interested in continuing the dialogue here.
Great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been really fun to talk with you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ricardo. This is a great conversation.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Muller, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf, Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, ARNAUD, WOLFF, Tim HOLLOSY, HENRIK, AHLENIUS, John Connors, FILIP, Forrest, CONNOLLY, Dan Demetri, Robert WINDHAGER, INACIO, ZOOP, Mark NEVES, COLIN, HOLBROOK, Phil KAVANAGH, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel ANDREEFF, Francis FORDE, TIAGO, NUNES, Fergal Kossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila DEZA-ARAUJO, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavla Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeagy, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanous, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Igni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.